Welcome, folks, to our podcast, Therapy on a Tangent. I'm Natalie, and this is my co-host.
Hi, folks. I'm Zori.
And this is the podcast where two therapists nerd out on our geeky passions and mental health. So, Zori, what have you been nerding out on recently?
So, at the time of this recording, it is March 22nd, Aries season. And actually, I'm kind of geeking about this new movie that's going to come out, I believe, on March 28th, called Death of a Unicorn. It's by A24. And for those of you who don't know, A24 has kind of been coming up as this like really good movie production company. And yeah, it has Jenna Ortega of Wednesday fame. I mean, she's been in other things, but like Wednesday is like one of her. And then I don't know, it just seems cool because we think of unicorns as like this beautiful, gentle creatures, and based off of the trailer, these unicorns are dangerous, like evil unicorns. So I don't know, that just seems like something that I'd be interested in, Natalie. So I'm kind of into that. We'll see if I go to the theaters to see it. Probably won't. Even before the pandemic, I wasn't really a theater girly, like sitting in the theater. So I'd probably just wait until it comes out online. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm super interested about.
Yeah, are these unicorns like your traditional idea of what a unicorn looks like, or are they also kind of more like scary looking?
So I don't know. So like based off of the trailer, they did show like a traditional unicorn, and I think the idea is that they accidentally killed one, but because of how they either because they killed it or because of what they do, because it seems like they killed it, and then who is in it? Will Poulter, the guy from the nerdy guy from Meet the Millers, I believe, who like glowed up. Um, he's in it as well, and his character is like, yeah, let's like make money out of it or whatever. So I think it's like one of those things where it's like either because they killed it or because they killed it and trying to like profit out of it. These like other unicorns that, again, at least in the trailers, it doesn't seem like we see like the full picture of them, but they seem scary. So it's like a little bit of magic and revenge and yeah, unicorns. So we'll see how this goes.
Okay, interesting.
What about you?
So, I've been thinking about getting back into Minecraft. I go through these phases where, like, I'll just play Minecraft, like, all the time for, like, a month or so, and then I drop it, and then I do something else. But I was thinking about, like, all the cool stuff I used to do on Minecraft with, like, redstoning and things like that. Because I think it just stimulates, like, a part of my brain where I want to, like, think very hard about how to make something work and problem solve and things like that and be creative at the same time. So I was thinking about that just because I feel like I've been lacking a little like that kind of creativity in my life recently. And it's fun to just kind of wander a world and do your normal like mundane picking stuff up kind of task. So that's what I've been thinking about. I think there's like new things since the last time I played Minecraft too. So I also just kind of want to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a question for you, Natalie.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the new Minecraft movie that's coming out?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. I don't know. I have mixed thoughts on it just because like the fact that it's a live action, that's what really throws me off. Because I'm like, how much of a live action can you really turn Minecraft into? It's a blocky game, and so just to have like real life blocks and real life blocky animals, like I don't know, that just seemed really weird for me. So I don't know. I feel like it's going to be funny and entertaining for people. I think the concept itself just kind of like throws me off. And it doesn't like it doesn't sit right with me. There's something about it that feels a little cringy that they've turned it into a live action. I think if it was like an animated movie, maybe it feels like it fits more. So
Yeah, like a la Lego movie,
yeah,
kind of.
yeah, like that seems like that makes sense. But this feels like it makes sense less. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I guess I will have to see it and then make my judgments from there. Do you have any thoughts about it?
No, I mean, well, I don't play Minecraft, so, but I just heard a lot of like rumblings that people of the Minecraft community were not happy. So I just wanted to know what you thought.
Yeah, I think it just doesn't sit right with people for some reason. I don't know. It feels like people who don't really play Minecraft decided to make a movie.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. So, well, today I wanted us to talk about Arcane, which is something that I was geeking out on for a very long time just because there's so many things that you could talk about with like dynamics between people, even like the story in general about like what happened, what the groups of people are that emerge from it, the kind of conflict that happens too. And I think also the fact that like spoilers for people who haven't seen it, but it ends in season 2, but there isn't quite like an ending, right? Which I guess makes sense because it's meant to be like an open world kind of thing, and obviously we can't know everything that's going to happen. But the fact that it's just like so open ended at the end, and you don't know like you want more of it, and then there's so many speculations of things, but you were not going to get that. So I just thought it'd be interesting for us to talk about that a little bit more. And I think a good start point is talking about like the relationship between Vi and Jinx, or Vi and Powder, who are our main protagonists for a large part of the first season and into the second season as well. So
Before we go into the relationships of Vi and Jinx, I think it's maybe a little bit important to give a little context for those who may have not seen Arcane or who it's been a while. So, Natalie, would you like to explain a little bit about what is Arcane? What is the show about?
yeah, so Arcane takes place in the League of Legends universe. So this is a world that's created by Riot, and League of Legends is a very popular game. It's a massive multiplayer online game. And so like there's different characters with their own backstories. There's lots of different worlds, I suppose. It's one world, but there's different parts of the world that the story is focused on. So in Arcane season 1 and 2, it's focused on just a specific part of the world, which is Piltover and Zon. And then it also takes place kind of like in almost like a futuristic kind of world where technology is advancing, and there's also this like vague idea of magic that used to be in the universe, but we can't harvest the magic now. And so part of the storyline is these people who are like scientists trying to harvest like the arcane, which is like the magical kind of energy that's in the world, and try to use that to advance technology. And then we start seeing like how does this world change because of it. So we do see it becoming a lot more technologically advanced. And of course, what comes with technology, the advancement of technology, is also conflict, because now society is not as simple as it used to be. There's more tools available, but there's also more resources that, again, causes conflict when there is like a scarcity to control certain resources amongst people. So it follows a couple main characters that we see in the show. And so I think we might try to do like a mini series in our podcast just talking about some of these relationships between the different characters.
Yeah, because there's a lot of characters, and for those of you who don't know League of Legends, there's many characters, like Natalie said, who all had their own stories. And honestly, if we tried to talk about all of those characters in one episode, this podcast would be hours long. So, as Natalie said, we're going to focus on two of the characters, and honestly, in the Arcane TV show, these two are kind of the main driving force with a lot of the plot points. Two sisters, Vi and, well, now we call her Jinx, but she used to be called Powder, who are kind of, they help us see more of the world, both the positive and negatives, as Natalie said, and also the ways that technology can be good and also be negative, and also further increase systemic injustices between groups of people. I guess who should we start off with first? Vi, Jinx, both of them? How should we start this, Natalie?
Well, let's start with Vi. So Vi is the older sister in this relationship dynamic, and Powder, when Arcane started, Jinx, her name was Powder, which is her birth name, and Jinx seems to be very young in this dynamic, almost like a child that needs constant care and support, always needed like reassurance. And Vi was like that big sister that was like, I got everything, I'll take care of you, things will be fine. A big piece of context is that Vi and Powder's parents are actually deceased when the show starts. And so I think that plays into their dynamic too, where Vi feels like she has to take on like that mothering role for Powder and put on that brave face because they no longer have parents. And so Vi being the older sibling, she was the one that naturally took up the parenting roles. They were in some ways adopted by Vander, who becomes kind of like their guardian, and he takes in other kids who also didn't have parents. But in the sibling dynamic, you could definitely tell that like Vi feels like she has to be the parent, and Powder is the child, like the helpless child.
And I was just going to add, it's also important, or sometimes even helpful for our listeners who have not seen it. Vi at this point, at the beginning when we first meet them, is only 15, and Powder is 11. So that's a lot of pressure to put on a 15-year-old to kind of be the adult, be the caretaker of her younger sister, even with Vander around.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the way that Vi behaves, she certainly acts more like older than the 15-year-old, right? That's in her attitude or mannerisms, but also she still embodies some of that adolescent energy where you get adolescents that feel invincible, like they can do anything, they can't die, and the world isn't a scary place yet. And so we see that a lot in the way that she kind of even led like this almost like a gang of kids who didn't have parents. She behaves as if like, we can't be killed, we're unstoppable if we work together and things like that. I think she still is cautious, but she definitely has this attitude of like, we're invincible. We could do anything that we want.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as well, again, considering how old she is, because she does take over this like caretaker role for Powder, but it's also interesting because you can see the way that she views Powder as a younger sibling, as someone that she has to protect. But then also there's some times where you see her be like, oh my gosh, why can't you grow up? Why can't you do these things? Why do I always have to protect you as well? And it's like this very like interesting, or at least for me as an only child, this very interesting dynamic of like, this is someone who is my younger sibling. I have to take care of them, but also like, oh my gosh, take care of yourself as well, which I think is definitely something that, at least in terms of the clients that I work with, I see in terms of their sibling relationships as well, where they feel the responsibility, but then also that pressure of being the oldest sibling, of the caretaker, and especially in this situation where they no longer have their parents, we can kind of see how that plays into their sibling dynamics and relationship as well, where it's kind of Powder is like, damn if you do, damn if you don't. Either she's too small, too young to do things, or she's, not doing things right. But again, she's only 11. So, she's still very much a child, just like Vi is as well. But still, we see how that plays into their dynamics where I don't know. And correct me if I'm wrong. Where I kind of feel like the odds are already stacked against Powder, even before spoilers, even before things really start hitting the fan.
Yeah, and I think it's the way that Vi portrays Powder. And I think when we see it happening in the show, we see it a lot through like Vi's eyes that like, she's small, she's little, she needs to be protected and all these things. She's not capable of doing all these things because it opens up with like that tragedy where their parents die. So you immediately see the world through Vi's eyes, where she sees that like Powder's somebody that needs to be protected. And that is very much the way that she had viewed Powder probably almost their entire relationship, that she's somebody that needs to be protected. But what's interesting, I think, for me is that, like, if you really pay attention in the show, Powder actually has a whole lot of assets. Right? She's very smart. She makes like these little grenade gadget things, and so like she has a lot of intelligence. But it's because we are so sucked into like Vi's version of this that it's really easy to miss the fact that like Powder was probably not as helpless as Vi was making her seem.
Definitely think looking back at it as a viewer, you're right. Like we do see a lot of it from Vi's perspective, where it's just like that younger sibling who, like, I don't doubt that Vi loved Powder, but definitely she felt frustrated by Powder. And as I said, I definitely feel like there was an element of I wish you would grow up so I didn't have to take care of you anymore. And I think even in adulthood, I know we're kind of jumping around the place, but like even in adulthood, we still see Vi viewing Powder, now Jinx. We'll get into a little bit why she's calling herself Jinx now, but how Vi views Jinx as that same little girl, and how Vi, up until a certain point, still views Jinx that way, even though Jinx is like, no, there's a lot that has happened. There's a lot that has changed. And, before they had reunited, Jinx had finally, for better or worse, again, we'll talk about it, met people who kind of helped grow in who she was. Now, was that the best way to grow? It's up for debate. But like she met a man, Silco, who to a certain extent is also like Jinx's second adopted father after Vander, who, spoiler, at this point, they think is no longer alive. But Silco, at least, even though he's doesn't have the best morals, Silco at least sees Jinx. Silco at least sees the potential that Jinx has, even when she was still Powder. And I think that's something that, again, Jinx Powder never got out of Vi. And again, I don't want to put all the blame on Vi because, again, she was a child as well. And I think if Vi was actually an adult when she received or had to take care of Powder, I think things would be a little bit different. I would hope. But I think because Vi, like you said, is a child, is a kid, thinks she's invincible, all those type of things as well, seeing Powder being essentially like a weak point, a weak spot, is frustrating, especially when you're a teenager, when you think you're invincible. And I think that kind of unfortunately never goes away for Vi, at least in the first season, when it comes to like Jinx and Powder. And we also see how that, again, that dynamic of taking care, you're my responsibility, kind of comes into play in terms of their sibling relationship as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is a normal sibling relationship too, especially with people who are pretty close in age. Because I do think Vi and Powder are relatively pretty close in age towards one another. And so I think the reaction is like, why can't you be more like me? If I could do this, why can't you do this? And then, again, that's part of like an adolescent mindset too. It's hard to distinguish themselves from other people. They're still just learning how to individuate as people themselves. And so it's hard for them to register like everyone is a separate person from me. And I think that's where there's a lot of bitterness that gets pent up in Vi, because she's like, you see that she's somebody who's really tough. Like she's really into boxing and she's strong and she could do all these things. And obviously like Powder admires her for that. And you can see that like Powder's trying to keep up. But, we know that Powder's also not Vi and they're not the same people. And so I think that's what's really hard for even the both of them that early on to recognize that they are separate people. And I think, Powder gets down on herself too, that she can't do these things, or she sees herself as weak. And she doesn't recognize that she is her own person. So when she gets that opportunity to be her own person, that's when we see like that shift in like the
Mm-hmm.
names that she calls herself by, right? She goes from being called Powder to Jinx because I think she lets go of that image of who Vi wanted her to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really cool that you said that because I think that just adds another layer to the point where they do split. So in the show, through a series of very unfortunate events, I'm not going to go through all of it because it would be really confusing for those who haven't seen it. But basically, what happens, both Vi and Powder, they lose their friends and they lose their first adopted father, Vander, through a series of unfortunate events. And these events for Vi seem very much like if Powder wasn't there, if Powder didn't try to help, they wouldn't have died. They're essentially their family, their second family wouldn't have died. And I think it's really interesting how you said like, Vi's like, why can't you be like me? And like thinking about individuality as a development stage because I think this is kind of where sure you could look at it as Vi, being mean, being cruel to her sister and during a time where, yes, it was an accident. Yes, they need to stay together. But I can definitely also see it, especially for 15-year-old Vi, as like a point of because we are so entwined, because we are so enmeshed, like, this isn't even your fault. I may be saying this is your fault, but consciously or unconsciously, this is my fault because you are me. You are a part of me. And the only way I can think of this of getting rid of these thoughts or getting rid of some of these negative thoughts in terms of like what did I do to contribute to this situation is to cut you off, kind of like cut you off like this, like a dying branch or whatever. And of course we see Powder being really like not great for Powder. Like, yeah, she's 11 again, just lost a lot of people who she was really close to, just lost her second father figure, and now she's losing her sister, and we see her break down. And again, I think that would happen for anyone in that situation, but I think especially in the context of the show and the context of these two relationships, it's also we're kind of seeing how Powder view herself as part of Vi as well, and now like, oh my gosh, I've been cut off from the other half of me. Like, what does that mean? And I think as we continue on in the show, as they grow older, and when they meet each other years ago, maybe to a certain extent, both of them, definitely Vi is trying to bring back Powder, trying to get in contact with the Powder that she believes is still there in Jinx. I think Jinx is like, maybe I think there's a certain element of like nostalgia with being reunited with Vi, especially when they first meet. But I think at that point, Jinx has kind of like realized I am my own individual, while Vi, even as an adult, even as they're older, is still like, no, Powder Jinx is still part of me. And I think unfortunately Vi has to realize a very harsh and cruel way that that is no longer true.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think what you're talking about with that enmeshment is so true because it almost feels like they have to be like one entity whenever you see them in the story. And there's an idea that's called splitting, where you separate your good and bad parts because everybody is good and bad, right? We have good and bad parts, but when like the bad parts of us are so difficult to sit with, we like split that off and then we project that onto somebody else. And so that means like I'm a good person, but now this person is bad. And I think that's what happens between Vi and Powder when their friends died and their adoptive father dies, because it was so hard for Vi to sit with like this was a failure. I made some mistakes that also caused this to happen. So instead of recognizing the bad parts, she split that off and put that onto Powder. Like, I did the best I could to save our friends and family, but you did this really bad thing. And so that makes you all bad. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think even that's that contribute to how Jinx became Jinx, because Powder really internalized this idea that Vi was good and I'm the bad parts. And so
Mm-hmm.
instead of trying to fight that idea, she internalized that, and that almost felt like it became a part of her personality, a part of what built Jinx, that persona, that Jinx
Mm-hmm.
is somebody who is bad. Even though as we progress in the show, we see that Jinx isn't all bad. It's a lot more complicated than that. But that's what it feels like. That's what got internalized in that identity.
Yeah, and we see that internalization through, I guess you can call them like hallucinations of the two friends that died. I'm not really going to get into whether or not Jinx has a diagnosis or not, but for storytelling purposes, those hallucinations, as you said, are the internalization at the very least of those negative feelings that she has about herself due to what Vi said the last time that they met when they were, 11 and 15. And it's not until the second season later on where I know that I, some of those hallucinations, some of those negative self talk, I guess, internalization, negative self talk that Jinx has, are, if not go away, they quiet down because of the introduction of a new character, Aisha.
I guess the simplest way to describe it is Aisha is just kind of a kid that Jinx picked up off the street. We presume that Aisha is another orphan child. There is a lot of orphan children in Zion just because of circumstances of how that society came about and, how that developed. So Jinx was fighting off some bad guys and inadvertently saved Aisha in that process. And so Aisha starts to, it's almost like a duckling imprinting on a duck. Like Aisha imprints onto
Yes.
Jinx, and she starts following her around, wanting to be like Jinx, and they build almost I want to say it's almost like a sibling relationship, but of course it's like a very large age gap. But it's, Jinx starts to treat her almost like this little sister that she has, and now Jinx is the older sister in that relationship. And we
Yeah.
also see Aisha has this almost idealized view of Jinx where, she thinks Jinx is really cool. She tries to be like her. She tries to dress like her. She even tries to learn how to wield a gun like Jinx does. So they build this close relationship in a almost idealized way. I think Aisha also fulfilled some sort of need that Jinx had as well. And so it's, the relationship is a little complicated because I think Jinx and Aisha fulfilled something important for each other in that relationship.
Yeah. And I mean, I think when you compare that relationship to Powder and Vi, I think it's really interesting because one, like you said, there is a definitely difference in age between Jinx and Aisha and Vi and Powder when the story first started. And going back to like what I said earlier, I think that age difference does help to a certain extent, not only in terms of like just differences in age, but more experience in terms of like Jinx understanding who she is as an individual compared to Powder and Vi, where we talked about again that enmeshment, that like viewing themselves as like part of each other. And so yes, we do see Aisha emulating Jinx to a certain extent, but from what I understand, and it's never Jinx forcing her ideas about who she is and who Aisha is on Aisha. She allows Aisha to explore. And if it just so happens that she's interested in doing some of the things that Jinx seems to be interested in, she, leaves room for that. She kind of allows Aisha to play around with things. There's like one scene with she's playing around with a bomb, and Jinx is just talking to her, very casual. There's something that happens where Jinx kind of just takes it from Aisha's hand and like fixes it before it blows up, but it's very just kind of just like, yeah, this is what happens. This is what we do, instead of just being like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? You're messing up, that type of thing. It's kind of I'm going to let you learn and explore for yourself, but obviously I'm going to be a safety net for you if necessary, but only, when necessary. Like, I'm going to let you explore, which I think is something that Jinx as Powder didn't always get from Vi. I just think it's really interesting comparing that sibling relationship between Jinx and Aisha to the sibling relationship between Powder and Vi.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder if like Jinx being in that older sister role put things in perspective about perhaps her relationship with Vi and what that was like for her growing up, because it seems very apparent that like Jinx is probably thinking about her childhood when she interacts with Aisha, right? She's thinking about how she didn't want to make Aisha feel like she's not useful or helpful or things like that. She wanted her to feel like she has like her own independence, she can make her own choices, and that's not something that Vi gave her. But I do wonder if it helped her understand how she looked up to Vi in the same way that Aisha looked up to Jinx, and wanting to do something
Mm-hmm.
different than what her older sister did. And in some ways I wonder if for her that's a corrective emotional experience, to be like, this is the sister I wish I could have had, to be able to like see me when I was idealizing her, right? Because Powder definitely chased after Vi, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure to a certain extent she probably would have wished that Vi would have been able to say something like, hey, you don't have to be like me. You could be your own person and things like that. Even with like the interaction that Jinx has with Aisha, she, of course, like she's still gonna let Aisha like dye her hair blue so that it matches her hair and things like that. But it was all very like hesitant in a way. Like, are you sure you want to do this? Like, if this is what you want, then that's totally fine. But I want to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that this is what you want. And that didn't
Mm-hmm.
always feel like the case for Vi and Powder. It almost felt like
Mm-hmm.
you have to be strong. You have to learn how to do this. And that just wasn't who Powder was at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, thinking back to the therapy sessions, like the therapy room, we talk a lot about, or sometimes we talk about, like, healing the inner child type of work. And for Jinx, she has a physical manifestation or a representation of that in Aisha. But sometimes we don't have that in our real lives. And I think it is a good thought experiment to do with clients in terms of thinking like, how would you have treated yourself as a child? How would you have navigated things in ways that those around you, parents, guardians, adult figures, didn't? And I think that can be really healing to like let you know that these things happen, yes, in the past, and especially for Jinx, like, yes, these things happen. You lost the second family of yours, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Obviously, with Jinx, there's a lot of complexity in regards to morals and stuff like that. But even with all of that, I don't think we can necessarily call Jinx a bad guy. Just like I don't think we can necessarily call many, if not all, of the characters in Arcane bad guys. I think there's just complexity. I think there is things that come into play when we think about their backgrounds and history, that understanding them and knowing them, it helps us understand how they got to that point, and realizing that a lot of these characters, even if they do bad things, oftentimes they're doing it because they're trying for the best. They're hoping for the best. They want the best, which is true for even of Jinx's second adoptive father, like Soko. Like, if we're just watching maybe like the first few episodes, you would definitely think like, okay, yeah, bad guy. He has like the bad guy look. He looks like the type of bad guy who's like in his secret lab. But even in the first season and definitely in the second season, we learn a little bit more about him and about his relationships. And sure, we may not agree with the way that he went about things, but it was for like in his idea like a better future. And we can definitely see that even with Jinx, he definitely cared about her. She wasn't just a pawn. Maybe she started off that way, but I truly think that he saw Jinx as like a second daughter, or well, I don't know if he had a first daughter, but as a daughter for him. And I think even though he wasn't probably the best guy morally, I think to a certain extent he did help Jinx heal from what she was experiencing with the disconnect, cut off from Vi. And I think if it wasn't for him, I guess we could talk about that. We could talk about the alternate reality powder. But at least in this reality, Jinx wouldn't have become her own person in the same way. And I think that's really interesting. And I know I just mentioned that, the alternate version of Powder, even she became her own version of herself from what we saw. But even that had required that version. And I know this is getting really confusing, but at a certain point in season 2, one of the characters, Echo, an old childhood friend of Jinx, goes to this like alternate reality where he meets Jinx, but she's still going by Powder. And this is like if all the bad things that happened in Jinx's life didn't happen, except for in this reality, Vi died. So Vi is not there. So it's still like an element of Vi has to leave either through death or through her own terms for Jinx and or Powder to become their own person. And I think that's really interesting. And I also kind of feel bad for Vi in the sense because it makes it feel like Vi is the problem when I especially in the context of this show, I don't think Vi is a problem. I think it's the whole system, the whole society that's the problem. But yeah, that was just really interesting to think about. Like, yeah, again, in some way, shape, or form, there has to be a disconnect from Vi for Jinx or Powder to become their own person.
Right. But I think that's the complexity of sibling relationships. And I know you mentioned that you're an only child, Zori. I'm a middle child with, two other siblings. And so I understand that dynamic very well, where it's like you're trying to separate from your other siblings and be yourself, but it's so hard to do that when you're constantly exposed to them all the time. And then there's that expectation of like, we're siblings, so we have to share things, right? We have to be similar in some ways. And so it's hard to let go of that idea that I'm my own person with my own goals, my own aspirations, because you're automatically in the system of like, I need to do what my older sibling is doing, or I need to protect my younger sibling, because that just feels like that's what the role is. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like a lot of siblings become closer in adulthood because that's when they finally recognize that they could be their own person. But when they are younger,
Mm-hmm.
it's so hard to make that separation because either you're like, again, you're already born into the system, right? You already have these expectations, these roles. But then there's also the people around you that facilitate that too, where, because as well meaning as it was, Vander would always say to Vi, like, you're the oldest, so you have to take care of these kids. And so that was the
Mm-hmm.
role that was already placed on her, where she felt like I have to take care of all of these kids because I am the oldest. And then it puts Powder in that position of like, well, I'm one of the kids and I need to be taken care of. And so it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
make that separation early on because you're forced to be in that role.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I don't know how this keeps popping up. I don't know. The algorithm is weird, but on Instagram, I keep getting videos of like siblings, but they're like siblings with like big age gaps. So like the young sibling would be like 5 or 6, and then the older sibling would at least be in their like teens, like older teens, or sometimes even like technically an adult themselves. And it's And it's just really interesting seeing how, like, in a lot of those captions, the person who is capturing like these moments, usually the parent, is just like, my oldest child thinks their younger sibling is their baby kind of situation. And I don't know, it's just really interesting again because I see those, but then I also see like ones where it's siblings, but they're definitely much closer in age. And I don't think there's an necessarily an issue either way when handled appropriately by like parents, guardians, adult figures. But it's just really interesting to see sibling relationships. And I don't know, again, maybe it's because I grew up as only child. I do technically have half siblings, but didn't meet them until adulthood. So it's just really interesting to like see siblings interact with each other in a variety of different like in terms of like age gaps and or lack of age gaps as well. And again, I think it's funny because we see, like we said, Jinx being better for Aisha than Vi was for Powder. And though a lot of different things come into play, I do think having that, like, I am actually an adult. Because at this point, like, I think Jinx is like 19, and I think Aisha is 8 or something like that. Like, Jinx is an adult, and I think she's used to having responsibilities to a certain extent where it doesn't feel like such a heavy burden as Vi did. Because, as you said, Vander was like, "You're the oldest; you had to take care of not only Powder, but also the two other kids, their two other friends as well. Technically three, because again, the other childhood best friend Echo was also part of their group as well, and that was a lot."
Yeah. And, I think it's important even to think about like Powder at 19 is still trying to figure out herself as well. I guess Jinx at that point, right? Jinx is still trying to figure out herself as well, but you do see kind of almost this integration of herself where she's starting to understand like the good and the bad parts, and that's what makes up all of me. And I think that's when we really start to see like complexity in her character, where she has like this these conversations with herself of like, what should I be doing morally, right? I'm not like I want to be able to do these things. I really care about like Aisha. I do care about Vi to a certain extent, but also, I have these feelings like I don't do the right things, and I could be a
Mm-hmm.
bad person. But we see her evolve into somebody who feels a little bit more whole, where
Mm-hmm.
she starts doing things that are more selfless, because then it's recognizing that like I do have some good in me, which is where we see a lot of that relationship that she has with Aisha too. Like, I'm being that good sibling and being that good parent, in a way, and then that influences what she ultimately does in the world, in the choices that she makes, because it stops being very self-centered, like, what I want, and it stops being about like the anger and the bitterness, but it also starts to become a little bit more selfless, where she is considering like other people and what's best for other people as well. So she gets to this point where like she is trying to be a whole person, but
Mm-hmm.
it takes so much influence too, right? She had to be away
Mm-hmm.
from Vi. She had to have some perspective about what it was like to be that older sibling. She had to reflect on like
Mm-hmm.
her own childhood, what parts of her had to, I guess, like the way that they kind of talked about, like, how do we let go of Powder, right? So how do we let go of
Mm-hmm.
that bad, that wholly bad version of yourself, and become somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's a lot more whole with the good and the bad.
Yeah. So, Natalie, we've been talking a lot about Powder Jinx, and we've been talking about Vi, but we kind of been talking about Vi as like her younger self. But what about Vi as an adult? How do we see like this sibling relationship, this enmeshment play out with Vi as an adult?
So as an adult, I don't think she has changed all that much from when she was an adolescent. It's very apparent that she still is stuck in like her views of like who Powder is and what
Mm-hmm.
Vi's role is as a sister to Powder. even though powder doesn't technically doesn't exist, right? We're talking about Vi and Jinx now, and Jinx is a different person than who Vi knows, and she really has a hard time just grasping this idea that this person is no longer powder. This person is Jinx
Mm-hmm.
now. And so, like, she's the way that she is relating to Jinx is that I need to save powder. And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
I need to fight against Jinx or whoever this person is so that I could bring powder back. But it's really hard for her to separate from that enmeshment. Like, you could tell she's really still enmeshed with powder emotionally, and she starts to get almost into this like savior complex, right? She wants to save
Yeah.
powder.
Yeah, and we definitely see that in like the first season where, they it's they kind of meet the first time and Vi's like, oh, hey, Powder, this is what we need to do, blah, 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 blah. And Jinx is kind of just like, oh, wow, no one has called me Powder in a long time. And then, again, Vi's like surprised that Jinx is not going along with her like she would when they were younger. And then it kind of, especially in the first season, it gets to a head where Jinx, if I remember correctly, kidnaps Caitlyn, who is, kind of Vi's love interest, especially in the first season. They do eventually get together, but in the first season, they're still kind of like, will they, won't they? Even at that point, you still see kind of Vi trying to like argue, like, hey, Powder, blah, 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 like, don't do this. I know you're not like this. But, Jinx is like, you don't know me. And I think that's kind of the point where maybe in season one, Vi is like, wow, I don't know this person. Like, I thought I knew this person like the back of my hand because like that's how we used to be. Like, this person used to be a part of me and I used to know this part of me, but now I don't. And then in season two, we kind of get this. I don't know about you, but it kind of like made me think about like that point again where they broke off after the death of their like second family when Vi tries to like kill or yeah, essentially kill Jinx. Where it's just like, okay, you're not behaving, you're not acting in the way that I want you to act and behave in, so I need to get rid of you. You are a part of me, and I need to get rid of you. And it for me, seeing that scene kind of reminded me of that. But then you have Aisha who like jumps in and like protects Jinx and I don't know, like maybe reminds Vi of like who this person is. Like, yes, this is not the Powder that she knows, but this is still her sister. Um, yeah, yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, there's still that same splitting dynamic that's happening even in adulthood because I think Vi just kind of interacts with that part differently. Where, like, before, when they were younger, Powder being that bad part, it's like, oh, I gotta protect Powder, I gotta fix her, I gotta do all these things. But then in adulthood, it feels like Jinx is still that bad part, but now I need to kill it, right? I can't let it
Mm-hmm.
exist anymore in order for things to be restored. I need to make sure that this part doesn't exist anymore, which is very interesting to
Mm-hmm.
think about because like the this is where she's stuck, right? It's still the same feelings, the same kind of like perspectives and views, but her approach to like the bad part just changes. It's no longer about
Mm-hmm.
rescuing and saving, it's now about getting rid of a part, which I think happens a lot in families in general when you're so unwilling to shift your perspective on what you've projected onto other people. Like I think we see this a lot with kids and parents. A lot of kids like
Mm-hmm.
to split off their bad parts and then put that on their parents. And now it's not that I
Mm-hmm.
have good and bad parts, it's that I'm the good one. My parents are the bad ones. And so
Mm-hmm.
what we see that as sometimes is like the relational cutoffs, where like I just can't live with my parents anymore or I can't have contact with them anymore. And so my solution to making me feel whole is to just like sever off that bad part. And so I think that's what Vi is trying to do. Like the solution to like all these like bad feelings that I have is to just like cut off this part And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that's where we see where she's very determined to, like, you know, there's nothing I could do to fix Jinx. And so the only way the bad feelings could be resolved is if she just completely goes away. If I just completely cut her off, it's like out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. If I don't see her,
Mm-hmm.
the bad parts don't exist, which we know that that isn't real, right? Even if
Mm-hmm.
we cut off the bad parts, doesn't change that you yourself have bad parts.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that like this is what we see a lot of times when we're working with families, especially working with children and their parents. I also think that this is like something that we see working with individuals as well in terms of they themselves. Like either I need to fix this part of myself that I don't like or that doesn't fit the mold of whatever, or I need to like get rid of it. I need to hide it. I need to ignore it. And I feel like Vi is just like um a walking sign and depiction of negative coping mechanisms because like she has that instance where she almost kills her sister, and then she goes into like street fighting basically, and that's all she does, that's all she focuses on because like that's kind of who she feels she is when you strip away Powder or Jinx. Vi is a fighter. Initially she was in the context of Powder, she was a fighter to be a protector, but taking away that she no longer needs to protect someone, now she's just a fighter. And it's really interesting to see like because is she happy as a fighter? Is she feeling fulfilled as a fighter? It doesn't seem like that. And yeah, it's just really interesting. But then when Jinx comes back and, spoilers again, it's found out that Vander is actually alive, but he was like experimented on and stuff like that. She still kind of helps Jinx out, and that could again be part of that like protector element that she's like trying to kill or trying to get rid of, which I don't necessarily think in itself is a bad thing, like being a protector. I think something that by an ideal world would just be able to realize when do I need to be a protector and when do I need to, similar to like Jinx with Aisha, just let things play out, let Powder Jinx learn for herself and then step in when I'm needed type of situation. And I think that's when we're talking about Vi and Powder and Jinx and even when we're just talking about Vi herself in terms of like splitting parts, I think Vi to a certain extent, because again, this is all just like plot devices and stuff like that, is realizing like this idea of me being a protector, at first it was a burden. Then it was something that I wanted to get rid of, something that I wanted to disconnect because I didn't protect this person in a way that I was supposed to. And because of that, wow, left like a lot of bad things. And then coming back, trying to be a protector again for someone who doesn't need you to protect. And then getting rid of that protector kind of title and just being a fighter. Again, we're seeing that like, at least in the context of Vi and Jinx, like that still wasn't enough for Vi. That still wasn't fulfilling for Vi. We also see, again, spoilers, we see Jinx like sacrificing herself at the end. And I think, though obviously sad and probably not what Vi wants, I think that is that element, that like callback to Jinx with Aisha, with the bomb, that Aisha's playing around with, where that was a time where Vi just needs to let Jinx do it. And, um, not supporting, not supporting suicidal tendencies or anything like that, but, to make her own decisions, to make her own path and journey and decisions like that. And to ideally just be a support and if needed.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a really good mirroring too that you're talking about, where like Jinx decides to sacrifice herself and ends up dying. I think it mirrors when we go to that alternate universe where like Vi needed to die in order for Powder to become her own person. Because I think Vi is somebody that I think a lot of people can resonate with, because it's hard for her to figure out like who she is. Like, she doesn't have a sense of self outside of relationships with other people, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
how a lot of people feel, right? I don't know who I am if I'm not like attached to like my partner, or if I'm not attached to my family. They have a hard time figuring out like who am I as an individual. And I think Vi really embodies that idea, who has a really difficult time with her own self-concept. And so I think that's why it was so necessary for Jinx to have to die, because then that was when I think we saw like this turning point of like Vi is actually trying to figure out who she was outside of like trying to be that protector role, or trying to be just like a fighter and things like that. And that's when, you
Mm-hmm.
know, another spoiler, she actually gets into a relationship with Caitlyn, because I think once you put aside who Vi thinks she's supposed to be for other people, she's able to be her own person, and she's able to pursue like her own wants and needs and things like that, which we see turns into a nice romantic relationship with Caitlyn that has been like, we watch it being put off almost the entire series, because Vi is
Mm-hmm.
just so wrapped up in like her relationships with other people, like her relationships with like
Mm-hmm.
Powder and Jinx. So as tough as it is, sometimes we have to be removed. We have to figure out how to remove ourselves from relationships so that we can figure out like who are we actually as people and individuals, and find fulfillment, because we can't be fulfilled just by who we are in relations to other people.
Yeah, it's kind of like we need to take a step back from relationships, figure out who we are, so then we can show up better in relationships.
Right? And that's the healthier relationships too. So I talk with couples a lot about this, is that the goal is to be in an interdependent relationship with each other, and not an independent relationship, and not a codependent relationship. So when we talk about like interdependent relationships, it's that you and your partner both are their own individuals, and you know that your own individuals, and you're able to function as your own individual, but you guys are able to come together and build off of each other, and you're able to contribute to each other's happiness instead of being
Mm-hmm.
dependent on the other person to be happy. And so I think like this is why it's so important for people to learn to individuate, be their own person outside relationships, because then that means you do come back as like a stronger partner or a stronger like sibling, because you are secure in yourself as a person, and you don't have to rely on
Mm-hmm.
other people. And that's what gives you almost like the confidence to be able to navigate like really difficult relationships where like that emotional enmeshment can become a possibility.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, because this is not just for romantic relationships. This is for all relationships. Like, relationships should be something that adds on to who you are and who you are, but it should not be like completing, whether that's romantic or platonic relationships, because we are our own individual persons, individual wants and goals and stuff like that. And yes, that can align with either our partners or friends or our families, but we should still be able to find fulfillment within ourselves and within our own goals and identities as well.
Right. Well, Zori,
Right.
I think that's it for today. Did you have any other thoughts?
No, like I said, there's just so many different relationship dynamics that we can talk about in Arcane. And I feel like even though we talked a lot about Violet and Powder and Jinx and their sibling relationship, there's still so much more that we could probably talk about, especially if we're watching like a play by play of the show. But no, I think this conversation has been really cool, and hopefully our listeners thought it was cool and interesting as well, in terms of how some of the things that we see playing in the show also can play in real life as well. Just hopefully not as explosive or deadly as it does in
Dramatic.
the show. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this episode of Therapy on Tangent. If you liked what you listened to today, please remember to like and subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, Again, make sure you hit that bell button so you get notified whenever new episodes are out. And if there's a topic you would like to hear us talk about in the future, you could leave it in the comments or just email us at therapyonatangentpod@gmail.com. So I'm Natalie.
And I'm Zori.
And until next time, stay on a tangent. Bye, folks.
Bye.